A black judge walks into her own courthouse, but a white cop blocks her path. He doesn't ask. He assumes. He questions her authority, her identity, her very right to be there. The same racist system she spent years fighting just hit her in the face. And the real punch? She's about to rule on a case that exposes this exact injustice. A young black man falsely arrested. A white officer hiding behind excuses. But today, the truth won't be ignored. Will justice finally win, or will racism walk free again? Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. This story is just getting started, and you won't want to miss a second of it. Hit subscribe now. Judge Cassandra Graves' heels clicked against the marble floors of her New Orleans home as she rushed to grab her briefcase. The clock read 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes behind schedule. Today was no ordinary trial. It was a case that had the entire city watching, a case that could set a precedent in the fight against racial profiling. Julian Daly, a 22-year-old black man, had been arrested in his own neighborhood without cause. The prosecution argued it was a misunderstanding, just routine policing. But Julian knew better. The defense claimed he matched a vague description, yet he had committed no crime. His arrest, his humiliation, his night in a cold jail cell, it was all because of the color of his skin. And Judge Cassandra Graves knew all too well how the system worked against men like Julian. Throwing on her robe in the car, Cassandra barely listened as the radio buzzed with news updates. The city was tense. Protesters had already gathered outside the courthouse demanding justice. The police presence was heavier than usual, and the media was ready to turn every moment into a headline. Cassandra sighed. She had handled tough cases before, but this one felt personal. As she neared the courthouse, traffic crawled to a stop. Flashing lights, barricades, and chanting voices filled the air. The front entrance was flooded with reporters, their cameras ready to catch every movement. Cassandra knew better than to step into that chaos. Opting for the side entrance, she adjusted her robe, took a deep breath, and prepared for what was ahead. But just as she reached the door, a young white officer stepped in her path. His hand hovered near his belt. "Ma'am, I need to see some ID," he said, scanning her up and down. Leah arched an eyebrow, already sensing where this was going. "I'm Judge Cassandra Graves. I preside over today's trial." The officer didn't budge. "Sorry, ma'am, but I need to verify that. We've had reports of unauthorized individuals trying to access restricted areas." Leah's grip tightened around her briefcase. "I just told you who I am. I don't have time for this." She reached into her pocket, producing her badge. The officer took it, glanced at it, but still hesitated. "You match the description of someone we were told to watch for." Leah's breath hitched. Match the description. She had heard those words before, words that had justified countless unjust stops, arrests, and even deaths. Before she could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. "That's Judge Graves," said an older black officer stepping forward. "Let her through!" The young officer hesitated before nodding and stepping aside. Cassandra, holding back her anger, simply took her badge and walked past. But inside, something burned. She had a case to preside over, one about racial profiling, and she had just experienced it firsthand. Judge Cassandra Graves adjusted the sleeves of her robe as she made her way toward the courthouse's side entrance. The morning had already been stressful. Traffic delays, the weight of an important trial ahead, and the ever-present media frenzy outside the main entrance. She had no desire to navigate through reporters barking questions or cameras flashing in her face. The side entrance was the practical choice, a quiet, direct path to the courtroom. She reached for the door handle, but a sharp voice halted her mid-step. "Ma'am, hold it right there!" Leah turned to see a young white police officer standing rigid, his stance wide, one hand resting near his utility belt. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the morning light. New to the job, she guessed. His narrowed eyes scrutinized her with suspicion. "Yes?" she said, her voice steady. "This is a restricted entrance," he stated, stepping forward as though to block her path. "I need to see some identification." Leah exhaled slowly. She had encountered officers like him before, the ones who mistook authority for control, power for intimidation. She reached into her pocket and retrieved her judicial badge, holding it up for him to see. "I'm Judge Cassandra Graves. I'm presiding over today's trial," she said, her tone professional yet firm. The officer barely glanced at her credentials before shaking his head. "I'm going to need to verify that." Leah arched an eyebrow. "You have my badge. That should be verification enough." "Sorry, ma'am, but I was given strict orders to be on high alert. You match the description of someone we were told to watch for." The words "match the description" sent an icy chill through her spine. She knew exactly what they meant. A phrase that had justified countless stops, humiliations, arrests, even deaths. She kept her face neutral, but anger simmered beneath the surface. And what description would that be, officer? The officer hesitated, shifting on his feet. I can't disclose that information. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Let me get this straight. I'm standing here, showing you my official credentials, telling you I am a judge walking into my own courtroom. And you are refusing me entry because I allegedly match a description you can't even clarify? The officer's jaw tensed. I'm just doing my job, ma'am. No, Cassandra countered, her voice steel. You're misusing it. The officer's fingers twitched near his belt. I need you to step back while I call this in. He reached for his handcuffs. Cassandra's breath caught. Is he really about to arrest me? Stand down, Officer Sutherland! The command came in a deep, authoritative voice. The young officer's head snapped up, startled. Cassandra turned to see an older black officer stepping forward, his expression unreadable, his badge. Rad Captain Darnell Brooks. Sir, Sutherland started. She is Judge Cassandra Graves. Brooks interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. The presiding judge of today's trial, now put those cuffs away and step aside. Sutherland hesitated. Cassandra saw his throat bob as he swallowed hard. He was caught between his own misjudgment and a superior officer correcting him in front of a judge. Slowly he released his grip on the cuffs and slid them back onto his belt. Cassandra didn't move right away. She studied Sutherland, memorizing the uncertainty in his eyes, the way his hands fidgeted. He knows he made a mistake, but will he learn from it? She extended her hand and retrieved her badge from his grip. This incident will be reported, she stated, her voice measured. Sutherland gave a stiff nod but remained silent. Captain Brooks gestured toward the door. Apologies, Judge. Please, go on in. Leah met his gaze, searching for something. Understanding, regret, maybe an acknowledgement of the weight of what had just transpired. Reporters filled the back rows, pens poised, cameras flashing before the bailiff called for order. The case before her, the State versus Officer Cole Sutherland, had already drawn national attention. At the prosecution's table sat Julian Daly, a young black man whose entire life had been upended by a wrongful arrest. His posture was stiff, hands clenched together on the table as though bracing for yet another injustice. Across from him, Officer Cole Sutherland sat next to his attorney, his jaw tight, eyes forward. Cassandra recognized him immediately, the same young officer who had tried to block her from entering the courthouse that morning. The irony wasn't lost on her. Leah tapped her gavel once, silencing the murmurs. We will now proceed with opening statements, she announced. The prosecutor, Ava Sinclair, rose. A sharp, calculated woman, she wasted no time. Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is not just about Julian Daly. It is about a system that has long enabled officers like Cole Sutherland to act on bias rather than justice. Mr. Daly was not committing a crime. He was simply walking home when Officer Sutherland decided that he looked suspicious. She paused, letting the words settle. This is racial profiling, plain and simple. And today, we are here to hold this officer accountable. As Sinclair returned to her seat, Cassandra studied the jury, a diverse group, but their expressions remained unreadable. The defense attorney, Damian Roth, stood next. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, voice smooth, rehearsed. My client, Officer Sutherland, was doing his job. He was responding to a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. He made a decision based on the information available to him at the time. To claim that this was racial profiling is speculative at best. He gestured toward Julian. We will prove that Officer Sutherland acted within his duties and without malice. Cassandra kept her expression neutral, though inwardly she braced herself. She had heard this argument too many times before. Prosecution, you may call your first witness, Cassandra said. Ava Sinclair stood. The prosecution calls Julian Daly to the stand. Julian inhaled deeply before rising, adjusting his blazer. He moved with a quiet dignity that Cassandra found admirable. After he was sworn in, Sinclair approached. Julian, let's start with that night. Where were you coming from? Julian sat up straighter. I had just left my friend's house. It was around 9:30 p.m., and I was walking home. I lived 2 blocks from where I was stopped. Sinclair nodded. Did you notice anything unusual before the officer approached you? Julian hesitated, choosing his words. Just that I saw a patrol car slow down when it passed me. But I wasn't doing anything, so I didn't think much of it. Then, I heard someone call out, Hey, stop right there! What happened next? I turned around, and that officer, Julian motioned slightly toward Sutherland, was already reaching for his gun. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Cassandra tapped her gavel. Order! Sinclair continued, her voice steady. Did he tell you why he stopped you? Julian shook his head. No, he just kept saying I looked like someone they were looking for. When I asked who, he wouldn't say. He exhaled sharply. I told him I lived right down the street, that I had ID on me. He didn't care. Next thing I knew, he was shoving me against the hood of the car, cuffing me. Did he ever tell you what crime you were suspected of? No. Julian's jaw tightened. He just kept saying I fit the description. Cassandra's grip on her gavel tightened. Fit the description. The same words she had heard that morning. The same justification used time and time again to dehumanize black men like Julian. Thank you, Julian! Sinclair turned. No further questions! Now, she would hear him justify the very mindset that had led to Julian Daly wrongful arrest. Sutherland adjusted his tie before placing his right hand on the Bible to take his oath. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes, ma'am, he said, though his voice wavered slightly. His defense attorney, Damian Roth, gave him a nod, but Sutherland's gaze darted toward the prosecution. Ava Sinclair was already stepping forward, exuding confidence. Her reputation as a relentless prosecutor was well known. She did not tolerate evasions or half-truths. Officer Sutherland, she began, her voice clear and direct, tell us why you stopped Julian Daly in the night in question. Sutherland inhaled deeply. We received a call about a burglary suspect in the area. Sinclair nodded as she flipped through her case file. Let's go over that description. Can you repeat it for the jury? Sutherland hesitated. A black male, medium build, dark clothing. Sinclair let the words sit in the air before responding. That's all? Sutherland shifted slightly. Yes. So, Officer Sutherland, she continued, you're telling this court that you arrested Julian Daly based on a description that could match hundreds of men in New Orleans? Sutherland cleared his throat. He was acting suspiciously. Suspiciously how? Sinclair asked, raising an eyebrow. Sutherland exhaled, obviously uncomfortable. He was walking alone late at night in a neighborhood where he didn't seem to belong. There it was. The courtroom reacted almost immediately. A low murmur spread among the observers. Judge Cassandra Graves kept her expression unreadable, though inside the words struck her like a slap. Sinclair tilted her head. Where he didn't belong. Can you clarify what you mean by that? Sutherland swallowed hard. I mean, it's a high-income area. It's mostly families. And Julian Daly, a young black man, didn't fit that image in your mind? Sutherland hesitated again, rubbing his hands together as he tried to find a response that wouldn't condemn him further. Sinclair pressed on. Let's be clear. You saw a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, and that alone made you suspicious? Sutherland shifted uncomfortably. No, it wasn't just that. But that was the first thing you noticed, wasn't it? Sinclair cut in before he could finish. Sutherland took a deep breath but didn't answer. Sinclair turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Sutherland didn't have a valid reason to stop Julian Daly. He didn't see him breaking into a house, running, or carrying stolen goods. He saw a black man in a place where he personally felt he didn't belong. That's not policing. That's racial profiling. She let the words settle before turning back to Sutherland. When you approached Mr. Daly, how did he respond? Sutherland cleared his throat. He asked me why I was stopping him. Sinclair nodded. That's all? He simply asked a question. Yes. And how did you react? Sutherland hesitated. I ordered him to put his hands where I could see them. Sinclair walked a few steps closer. At that point, had he made any aggressive moves? No. Had he reached for a weapon? No. Did he attempt to run? No. Sinclair's voice sharpened. Then why did you shove him against the hood of your car and handcuff him? Sutherland's face reddened. I was following protocol. Sinclair let out a dry chuckle. Protocol? What protocol says you should arrest a man for simply existing? Sutherland's attorney, Damian Roth, finally stood. Objection, Your Honor, argumentative. Judge Cassandra Graves raised a hand. Overruled. Proceed, Miss Sinclair. Sinclair turned back to Sutherland, her eyes locked onto his. Let's try a hypothetical. If Julian Daly had been white, dressed exactly the same, walking on the same street at the same time, would you have stopped him? Sutherland opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence dragged on. I don't know, he finally muttered. You don't know? Sinclair repeated, voice laced with disbelief. Or you don't want to say? Sutherland shifted in his chair. I don't want to assume. Sinclair gave a small nod. Well, let's talk about assumptions, Officer Sutherland. You assumed Julian Daly was a criminal because of his skin color. You assumed that a black man in a white neighborhood meant trouble. You assumed your badge gave you the right to strip him of his dignity. Sutherland's lips pressed together. Sinclair took a step back, looking toward the jury again. That's why we're here today. Not just for Julian Daly, but for every black person who has been stopped, questioned, and humiliated for no reason other than racial bias. She turned back to Sutherland. Now, Officer Sutherland, do you believe you were justified in your actions that night? Sutherland's hands balled into fists on his lap. His throat worked as he tried to form words, but all that came out was a quiet, no. Silence settled over the courtroom. Sinclair gave a firm nod. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Cassandra Graves let out a slow breath. As Sutherland stepped down, he looked smaller somehow. This was bigger than just one case, bigger than one officer. This trial was about dismantling the system that allowed racial profiling to exist unchecked. Today, the truth had been laid bare. The question now was, what would be done about it? The courtroom was tense as the closing arguments began. The trial had stretched over days, but now, everything came down to this moment. The jury sat upright, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Journalists filled the benches at the back, their pens ready to document the outcome of what had become a nationally watched case. The trial of Officer Cole Sutherland was no longer just about Julian Daly. It had become a symbol of racial injustice in American law enforcement. Ava Sinclair stood, straightening her blazer before stepping forward. She turned to the jury, making direct eye contact, ensuring they felt the weight of what she was about to say. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady yet firm, "this case is not just about Julian Daly. It is about the very foundation of justice in this country. It is about the reality that black men like Julian are seen as criminals first and human beings second. It is about the truth that men like Officer Sutherland have been allowed to police with prejudice instead of fairness." She paced slightly, her tone sharpening. "We have heard the facts. We have listened to Officer Sutherland admit right here under oath that Julian Daly did nothing wrong, that he was simply walking in his own city when he was stopped, harassed, and arrested. And why? Because Officer Sutherland made an assumption, not based on evidence, not based on a report, but based on the color of Julian Daly's skin." Sinclair stopped, allowing her words to settle in the room before continuing. "What happened to Julian is not an isolated incident. It is part of a larger pattern. How many times have we seen this? How many black men have been stopped, searched, humiliated, or worse without cause? How many times have officers said, 'I feared for my life,' when no real threat was present? How many times have we, as a society, let it happen?" She turned to Julian Daly, who sat silently at the plaintiff's table, his hands clenched together. Julian Daly was lucky. He walked away. But what about the others? What about those who don't get to walk away? This case is about justice, not just for Julian, but for every black man who has been forced to live under suspicion for no other reason than being born black. Sinclair faced the jury again. "This is your moment. You have the power to say that this is unacceptable. You have the power to tell Julian Daly and everyone watching that racial profiling has no place in our legal system. I urge you to do what is right, to do what the law demands. Find Officer Sutherland guilty." She stepped back, her argument complete. Now, it was the defense's turn. Damian Roth, Officer Sutherland attorney, rose with calculated ease, buttoning his suit jacket before addressing the jury. His tone was measured, smooth, almost rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand the emotions in this room," he began, his voice deliberately calm. "We have heard powerful testimony. We have seen strong arguments, but we must not forget what this trial is about. Officer Sutherland is not on trial for the history of policing in America. He is on trial for a single decision made on a single night." He turned towards Sutherland, then back to the jury. "My client did what he believed was his duty. He responded to a call. He assessed the situation. He made a judgment call, not out of malice, but out of concern for the community he was sworn to protect." Roth folded his hands together. "Did he make a mistake? Perhaps. But mistakes are not crimes. Officer Sutherland did not use excessive force. He did not harm Mr. Daly. He detained him, as officers do every single day in this country, based on the information he had at the time. If we start punishing officers for making decisions in the moment, what precedent does that set? What message does that send to law enforcement?" He stepped closer to the jury box, lowering his voice. "I ask you to consider the full picture. Do not let emotions dictate your decision. The law is clear. This is not a case of intentional discrimination. Officer Sutherland acted within his authority, even if hindsight tells us it could have been handled differently." He let out a slow breath. "Do not convict an officer for simply doing his job." With that, he returned to his seat. Judge Cassandra Graves gave the final instructions to the jury, reminding them to weigh the evidence carefully. Then they were escorted to the deliberation room, leaving the courtroom in a hushed stillness. Cassandra leaned back slightly in her chair, feeling the weight of the trial pressing down on her. She had maintained her composure throughout, but deep inside she knew this case had tested her limits. She thought back to her own experience that morning, how Officer Sutherland had profiled her despite her badge, despite her title. If she, a judge, could be treated that way, what chance did young black men like Julian have? The hours ticked by. The jury deliberated behind closed doors. The public outside the courthouse grew restless. News cameras captured the growing crowd, people holding signs that read "Justice for Julian" and "End racial profiling now." Inside, Julian Daly sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, his fingers tapping anxiously against his knee. "What if they let him walk?" he whispered to Sinclair. She gave him a reassuring nod. "We presented the truth. Now we have to trust them to see it." The courtroom doors finally opened. The bailiff stepped forward. "The jury has reached a verdict." Everyone stood. The air was thick with anticipation. Cassandra adjusted her robe, preparing for what was to come. The jury foreman held a slip of paper in his hands, his expression unreadable. The moment of truth had arrived. The courtroom fell silent as the jury foreman stood, holding the verdict in his hands. Judge Cassandra Graves sat upright, her expression unreadable, though inside, tension coiled in her chest. This moment would decide not just Julian Daly's fate, but whether the system would acknowledge what had happened to him. The foreman cleared his throat and read aloud. "We, the jury, find Officer Cole Sutherland guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. For a moment, there was no movement. No sound, just the weight of those words settling over the room. Then Julian Daly exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging with relief. His mother, sitting behind him, clasped her hands over her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Judge Graves maintained her composure, though inwardly she felt something close to vindication, not for herself, but for Julian, for every black man who had been unjustly stopped, questioned, and treated as a suspect for simply existing. Across the courtroom, Officer Cole Sutherland looked stunned, as if he had truly not expected this outcome. His hands clenched into fists on the table, his face drained of color. His attorney, Damian Roth, leaned in, whispering something urgent, but Sutherland barely seemed to hear him. He was caught in the reality of what had just happened. Judge Graves cleared her throat. "Mr. Daly, do you wish to address the court before sentencing?" Julian hesitated. He hadn't expected this moment, and now that it was here, he struggled to find the words. He stood slowly, turning toward the jury, then toward Sutherland. "I've had to live with this for months," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "That night when you stopped me, when you arrested me, I knew I had done nothing wrong. But none of that mattered to you. You didn't see a person, you saw a threat. You saw a stereotype." Sutherland lowered his gaze, unable to meet Julian's eyes. "You took my freedom that night," Julian continued. "You made me feel powerless. And the worst part is, you never even thought twice about it." He exhaled sharply. "I don't know if this changes anything for you, but I hope it does, because I never want another black man to go through what I did." Silence hung over the room. Then, unexpectedly, Officer Sutherland stood. He turned to Judge Graves, then to Julian. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "I won't stand here and make excuses," he said, his voice uneven. "I thought I was doing my job. But sitting here, hearing all of this, I can't deny the truth. I let my biases cloud my judgment. I looked at you, Julian, and I saw a criminal, not a young man walking home." He swallowed hard. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Gasps echoed in the courtroom. It was rare, almost unheard of, for an officer to admit fault so openly. Judge Graves studied him, searching for sincerity. His words carried regret, but regret alone was not enough. An apology could not erase what had happened. It could not undo the damage. "You say you're sorry," she said, her tone firm. "But understand this. Your actions had consequences. You didn't just make a mistake. You abused your authority. You failed to uphold the justice you swore to protect." Sutherland nodded, shame flickering in his eyes. She turned to Julian. "Mr. Daly, I hope this verdict gives you some peace." Julian nodded, though he knew this was just one battle in a much larger fight. Judge Graves looked back at Sutherland. "Officer Sutherland, you will face sentencing at a later date. Until then, you are remanded into custody." The bailiff stepped forward. Sutherland nodded numbly, placing his hands behind his back as the handcuffs clicked into place. The same sound Julian Daly had heard that night, but now it was justice, not injustice, at work. As Sutherland was escorted out, Julian turned to his mother, who pulled him into a tight embrace. "You did it," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, we did." Judge Graves remained seated as the courtroom emptied. Captain Darnell Brooks approached, his expression solemn. "This won't fix everything," he admitted. "But it's a start," Leah sighed. "A start isn't enough." "No," Brooks agreed. "But it's something." Cassandra watched as Julian and his family left the courtroom, stepping into a world that, for the first time in a long time, felt a little closer to justice. Judge Cassandra Graves sat behind her desk in chambers, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of a legal pad. The courtroom was empty now, but the weight of the trial lingered in the air. The verdict had been handed down, and justice had been served, at least in this one instance. And yet, Cassandra knew the fight was far from over. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She straightened as Captain Darnell Brooks stepped inside, his expression thoughtful. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Brooks lowered himself into it, exhaling deeply. He rubbed his hands together, as if searching for the right words. "I just wanted to say," he began, "what happened today. It mattered." Leah studied him. "Did it?" Brooks nodded. "I know one case doesn't change everything, but for Julian Daly, it changed his world, and maybe for a few others watching, it opened their eyes." He leaned forward. "Judge, I've been in law enforcement for over 20 years. I've seen how deep this problem runs. But I refuse to believe it can't be fixed." Cassandra folded her arms. "And how exactly do you plan to fix it?" Brooks met her gaze. "By holding officers accountable, by training them differently, by making sure the next young cop who puts on that badge understands that protecting the public doesn't mean targeting black men." He exhaled. "I can't undo the past, but I can try to change the future." Cassandra wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that men like Brooks could shift the culture from within, but experience had taught her otherwise. "I appreciate that," she said carefully, "but good intentions aren't enough. This isn't just about individual officers making better choices. This is about a system that's been designed to work against people like Julian. Against people like us." Brooks nodded. "You're right, but today was a start," she sighed, shaking her head slightly. "A start." The words tasted hollow. Another knock sounded at the door. This time it was Julian Daly. He hesitated at the entrance, unsure if he was interrupting. "Come in," Cassandra said, straightening. Julian stepped forward, his posture more confident than it had been at the beginning of the trial. His mother stood just behind him, her eyes still glistening with the emotions of the day. "I just wanted to say thank you, Judge Graves," Julian said. "I know you were just doing your job, but it meant everything." Cassandra smiled for the first time that day. "You don't have to thank me, Julian. This was never about a favor. This was about justice, and you deserved it." Julian nodded, his expression serious. "I know, but still, I appreciate it." He hesitated, then added, "I know this isn't the end. There are a lot of other Julians out there. But at least today, I feel like we won something." Cassandra stood, extending her hand. Julian shook it firmly. "You did," she said, "and no one can take that away from you." As Julian and his mother left, Cassandra sat back down, exhaling slowly. Brooks rose from his chair. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I won't stop pushing for change." Cassandra met his gaze. "I hope you don't." After he left, she turned to the window, looking out over the city. The work was far from over. The system wasn't fixed. Tomorrow, another black man would be profiled. Another case would go unheard. Another family would be torn apart by injustice. But today, Julian Daly had won. And sometimes change started with just one victory. Justice is not just a verdict, it's a fight. And every battle won is a step toward change.